Good morning and welcome to the 15th meeting of the Health, Social Care and Sport Committee in 2025. I've received no apologies for this meeting. The first item on our agenda is for the committee to agree to take item 5 in private. Are members agreed? The next item on our agenda is to take oral evidence on a supplementary LCM on the Employment Rights Bill. The purpose of the Employment Rights Bill is to deliver the key legislative reforms set out in the UK Government's plan to make work pay. The Bill's explanatory notes state its purpose is to update and enhance existing employment rights and make provision for new rights, make provision regarding pay and conditions in particular sectors, make reforms in relation to trade union matters and industrial action, and to create a new regime for the enforcement of employment law. An earlier LCM lodged on the 11th of December 2024 by the Cabinet Secretary for Finance and Local Government was referred to the Economy and Fair Work Committee, and that committee considered the LCM on the 19th of March. A supplementary LCM was lodged by the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Social Care on the 3rd of April and referred to this committee. This LCM relates to provisions in the bill concerning social care negotiating bodies, which are included within Chapter 2 of Part 3 with further consequential amendments in Schedule 5. The committee is due to take evidence on the supplementary LCM from the Minister for Social Care, Mental Wellbeing and Sport at its meeting next week. And ahead of this, at today's meeting, we will hear from a panel of stakeholders in relation to the supplementary LCM. And I welcome to the committee Leslie De Jager, Director of People and Culture, Cornerstone, attending on behalf of the Coalition of Care and Support Providers in Scotland, Karen Hedge, Deputy Chief Executive, Scottish Care, and Dave Moxham, Deputy General Secretary of the Scottish Trade Union Congress. And we'll move straight to questions, and Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener. So this proposed legislative consent motion is part of the process of our National Care Service Bill, and which is now the Care Reform Bill. So I'd be interested just to hear from you, just to get us started about to what extent could this ability to have sectoral negotiation, so creating a body for sectoral negotiation for adult social care, to achieve the Scottish Government's aspirations for a national care service in relation to embedding fair work principles. And I'll just remind everybody I am still a registered nurse.
Thank you for having me here today. So there's something to be considered around about the definition of the type of negotiation that we will have. And there's question there around about parity, and you see that in the current LCM, but also in discussions that we've been having with trade unions and with government and with COSLA also. Firstly, I would come to the definition of whether it's sectoral or collective. So at the moment, there is disparity in what people who work in the independent sector, so whether they're working for private organisations or for charities or employee-owned organisations, and what those working in the statutory sector can access due to the negotiation that currently exists. For instance, one of those examples is those working in the statutory sector have negotiated access to have their SSC registration paid for. So there's something about the definition of whether it's sectoral or collective that also applies within the LCM, and whether or not we'd have that parity to those who are outsourced. So I think it's incredibly important that, and it's very good that the committee is considering this as we progress forward with both of those bills, and the intention would be that that detail would sit within the National Care Reform Bill.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry about that. Yes, from a trade union perspective, obviously national care reform and the bill through its various iterations, it's always been a priority for us to establish an underpinning of pay and other terms and conditions for staff in the sector, and obviously that's been particularly relevant for those not covered by other bargaining arrangements, essentially Agenda for Change or local authority rates. So in the respect that this discussion is taking place, obviously with the legislation down south and our deliberations on how that relates to the devolved and procurement-related sector here, it's very welcome that the discussion's taking place. It's very welcome that collective sectoral bargaining, again, I take the point about the slight differentiation there, is high on people's agenda. We're relatively positive. Things can always happen more quickly, but we're relatively positive around the developments that have taken place over recent years in taking forward the potential for bargaining architecture, and I agree with Karen, something that should be legislated for in the bill. I think our job now is just to work out how that best interacts and engages in legislative and competence terms with what's happening down south.
Yeah, go ahead, yeah.
Thank you. If I could just add that one of our concerns from CCPS perspective around the progress of legislation is that we really need action now. We can't wait for statute to make improvements to social care workers' pay. There is a desperate need for change right now. And we have been developing a model over the past 3 years, as Dave alluded to there, that is, for all intents and purposes, ready to go on a voluntary basis. It doesn't require a statutory underpinning to get it up and running. It's been pretty much ready for some time. How long would this regulation-making process further delay our start? How many more Scottish people would be waiting to have their needs met or having their needs poorly met because of high turnover and chronic staffing shortages? Care workers are continuing to struggle to make ends meet despite being highly skilled and qualified key workers who are doing really demanding work. So our request would be, let's not wait for legislation. We have a model that's ready to go. You've heard a reference to Agenda for Change and the progress that other national collective bargaining models have been able to make in improving terms and conditions. We don't need the legislation to be in place to improve pay terms and conditions for the rest of workers in the sector. We can move on that now.
And it comes to what my next question was going to be about, like what else could be prioritised now, because I know that the government, Minister Marie Todd said that there is a commitment for, they've got a long-standing commitment to the principles of fair work and more specifically enhancing the experience of Scotland's social care workforce. And we know that the workforce is a skilled workforce. When I visit local care organisations and speak to the staff, they're doing a lot, even more than their equivalent healthcare support workers would be doing in a secondary care setting. So I'd be interested to hear about what the difference, further funding of fair work initiatives, how would that help make improvements, and should that be focused nationally or locally?
So I think part of the remit of a consensual negotiating body with all the stakeholders around the table on an equal footing would be to discuss actually where is the money best spent to have the best impact. So the model that the working group, Scottish Government working group, has been working on for the past 3 years. It sets out a tripartite model with unions, employers and Scottish Government as the funders around the table on an equal footing, working to negotiate consensus on sustainable and meaningful settlements that deliver fair work for social care workers. So the remit is beyond pure pay, but looking at what other aspects should be focused on to deliver fair work. And what the legislation describes is something a bit different. It's a body, a tripartite body negotiating in the absence of Scottish Government with the ability just to make recommendations. So I think it's important that we don't lose sight of that actually having all three parties around the table is a really important way to ensure that we're aligning on all the priorities. It's also a democratic model, so each group within the model that we propose appoints its own members, and the group jointly appoints its chair. The member organisations would consult and take notes from their members, and the body sets their own remit, agenda and priorities. So with that democratic power to set your own agenda and priorities, that means that the parties within the negotiating body could take the views from members, whether that's employers or workers, to understand actually what's really important and what will make the best impact. The legislation, if enacted as written, risks undermining some of that. So what the legislation describes is a model where ministers appoint the members and the chair, ministers set the remit and ministers direct the priorities. So a far less kind of democratic approach, and in our view less likely to really address the key issues in the sector, because it doesn't have that quality and strength of voice coming from the sector. I think also really importantly, it's a voluntary model that we've been developing. So all three stakeholders are there consensually because of their commitment to a common purpose. And we set out that purpose is around parity, as Karen alluded to, parity across the sector for workers, whether they're in the third sector, whether they're in the independent sector, or whether they're working within the NHS or within local government, to have parity of esteem and parity of value in how they're treated. What the legislation, as currently written, describes is stakeholders being put together by regulations for purposes set by ministers. So there's not that common purpose coming out of the collective agreement of the group, but it being set by ministers. So we think it's really important, to your point around addressing broader fair work principles, that any model that is put into place is truly collaborative, is consensual, is voluntary, and that all parties are there on an equal footing. The Scottish Government, unions representing the workers, and member organisations representing employers.
Yeah, I know both Karen and Dave want to come in here.
Hi, thank you. So I have been in my role almost 8 years now. In all of that time, I've been involved in the Fair Work and Social Care discussions with colleagues in Scottish Government. And yet, in that time, we have seen a drop in the rate of pay given to care workers in Scotland who work in the independent sector. What that shows to me is there really is a requirement to put this on a stronger footing. Just having voluntary conversations won't make a difference in this space. At that time, care workers, just to let people in the committee understand, at that time care workers were receiving above the living wage. They're now receiving the living wage, and that's wholly unacceptable in our eyes. Now, clearly we're in challenging financial circumstances at this point in time, but that has consequences around retention of staff and the other things that Leslie spoke about earlier. So in the interest of time, I wouldn't repeat that, but I will raise some of the things which have been discussed. In the Fair Work and Social Care group, there are essentially three subgroups looking at, 1, the mechanism for the payment of the uplift, 2, terms and conditions, and 3, effective voice, in which the conversation around what the negotiation body would relate. Thinking about funding, that would relate specifically to the terms and conditions module or subgroup of the Fair Work and Social Care group. Things which have come up from providers and those who work in the sector in that group have been the reference I made earlier to registration fees with the SSC, access to better sick leave policies, better access to flexible working, and things like maternity and paternity pay. Work has been undergone to cost some of that, what that would mean for the sector, but again was never implemented, even although that group got to the end of that, again evidencing that we need something to put this on a stronger footing, such as a negotiation body.
Your question started with funding, which I'll address, and some of the answers moved on, I guess, to the potential impact of agreeing the LCM on the current arrangements that are being negotiated. So I'll try as quickly as I can to deal with them. On the funding, I mean, being frank, it does not really matter whether you're using the UK legislation, whether you're using Scottish procurement legislation, whatever architecture you're using. If the funding doesn't follow, it doesn't work. And that doesn't really matter, frankly, whether it's reserved UK legislation or devolved Scottish procurement legislation. If you ain't got the cash, it's not going to get funded, government's not going to be at the table, and it's not going to work. The second question that we moved into there, I guess, was more about whether agreement to the LCM impacts the current architecture that's being negotiated, and that's where there's a difference of opinion, because my view is government always holds the trump card. Government can create, in a sense, either through procurement legislation or other legislation, any negotiating machinery that it wants to, and every indication that we have is that government is committed to the tripartite model, the voluntaristic model we've been talking to, and the LCM confers on the government the power to introduce that. Indeed, depending on the progress of the social care bill, it may already have introduced that before the employment rights bill is passed. So the question for me here is, what changes? Now, our major concern before the amendments which provoked the second LCM was that the power of Scottish ministers was going to be limited. That is to say that the provisions of the UK Act would have applied in Scotland and Wales too, and that would have been a genuinely limiting factor and failed to align the power of Scottish ministers with respect to procurement and the delivery of social care with the conditions of the workers. So from our perspective, full commitment to the same process that we've heard about here, but we don't take the view that conferring on Scottish Government ministers the power to make sure that that happens diminishes that in any way.
Just a final quick question about this bill was introduced and is speeding through the UK government, and there wasn't really any broad consultation on the employee rights bill by the Scottish government owing to when it was introduced by the UK government. Is that going to be an issue, the fact that it wasn't really consulted here widely? So does that impact on devolved social care infrastructure, for instance, as we've already started to kind of talk about that?
Absolutely. So in Scotland, social care very much has a local nature of delivery. You know, the populations living in our urban areas require very different things to those living in our rural and remote areas, particularly for those staff who might be working in home care and having to travel long distances. So concern where legislation is being pushed through at this rate in Westminster without understanding or consultation with those living and working and employing people within those conditions. They might not truly understand the needs and the way that services are commissioned and procured. We do have a lot more collaborative working in the sector in social care in Scotland. So, for instance, thinking about the Granite City Care Consortium, whether or not the legislation would allow for that going forward, for those models where, you know, care workers and care organisations share, for instance, route planning, back office functions. There are things which really need to be understood when you're putting that legislation through Parliament to make sure that they enable the system to continue to flow and flex to meet the needs of local people in Scotland. So we need, you know, we need consultation to happen here, but also to happen in Westminster as well, to take account for that. Particularly, you know, answering about the financial aspect of this as well. We know that fair work requires fair commissioning and procurement, and the Care Reform Bill has been looking specifically around about fair commissioning, and work of the Scottish Government is now looking into fair procurement. That won't sit within the bill, but that the Scottish Government is taking that work forward is particularly important and will relate to whether or not the sector is then able to pass those fair work terms and conditions on in reality. So without cognizance of both settings, then the bill could fail.
Convener.
Torrance.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to witnesses. What are the challenges for adult social care sector in relation to establishing a national negotiating body, and what are implications and potential risks of the provision contained in the LCM?
So The challenges for the sector in establishing a national negotiating body is that the sector is very disparate. So we have lots of providers with lots of different specialisms delivering lots of different types of care and support. So it's not homogenous at all. There's a huge amount of variety within the sector. So as membership organisations, our challenge is to ensure that we are engaging adequately with different providers across the sector in positioning where we want to move to and taking views from different parts of the sector to make sure that our position within that negotiating body would be well informed and would be reflective of our membership and the variation within that membership. In terms of the risks, there's a number of risks both to our organisation as a membership body and what that means in terms of how we operate and the different type of service we'd be delivering to our members. But there's also a number of risks involved in setting up negotiating body altogether. Clearly, one of those risks is around industrial action. And I would hope that we can learn from other learnings from other sectors. So we've got Colleges Scotland, for example. There was the Strathesque report, came out in 2022. That was a very comprehensive report. They had, I think, 7 rounds of industrial action over the first 10 years of putting in place a national negotiating body. And there are a number of learnings from that we have looked to take into the design of the body that we're proposing. One of the key reflections that I've taken away from that is that it needs to absolutely be tripartite with the Scottish Government sitting around the table. If I could just give you a quote from the Strathesque report. A significant influence seems to be the way that the threats and actuality of industrial action have been used to lever last-minute ministerial pressure to reach a settlement. This has ultimately undermined the credibility of both negotiating teams, seriously disempowering the negotiating process itself. In consequence, a cycle of negative expectation has arisen that foresees a breakdown in pay negotiations as inevitable, followed by strike ballots, probable industrial action and a settlement eventually reached with some form of intervention from Scottish Government. Clearly, we don't want to end up in a similar situation in the social care sector. So we need to make sure we're taking the learnings from that. The setup for Scottish colleges was a bipartite arrangement and they were not empowered to make those decisions because Scottish Government were not sitting around the table with them. So let's make sure we don't make that mistake again. There were other recommendations such as independent chairing of the negotiating body as well that we've also sought to take on board in designing what sectoral bargaining could look like to operate successfully within social care.
Anybody else?
I would wish to raise the challenge that we have in terms of a sector where there is low union membership and how do we enable effective voice within that, and the need to explore further the work that government has been doing in the Fair Work and Social Care Group to enable that to happen. For instance, we have 2 very large employee-owned organisations in Scotland who have different mechanisms for that effective voice in that space. So we know that some care workers are using food banks right now. So how do we make sure within Effective Voice that their funding of membership is covered within that space too, so that they can be members of unions should they choose to be so. So that needs to be part of that negotiation. It's a bit of a chicken and egg scenario where we know that unionisation is likely to lead to them having better terms and conditions, but they can't necessarily afford to do that in the here and now. That needs to be considered when we move to this legislation. But coming on the back of what Leslie was saying about the tripartite model, I met last week with members of the Welsh Government and the Welsh Cabinet Secretary, and I know that they're working on the tripartite model also because they see that, based upon the evidence that Leslie was discussing, as being an effective mechanism too. So there's worth exploring, why we're doing that, and that really is because over the years, we've had discussions between commissioners, purchasers and providers, but not been able to deliver on the ground everywhere. There are areas where we have, but understanding how the money flows from one end of the system to the other requires that presence there from Scottish Government in that space. as for our organisations, we will need to build into place, mechanisms to effectively canvass our members to make sure they're effectively represented within that. I know that CCPS has been working towards that. Scottish Care already have a mechanism for the National Care Home contract, and we would look to extend that to cover our other members who deliver different forms of social care. So I suppose this is a note to the committee to say we're on it.
So your original question was, what are the difficulties? I think they're manifest. I think all added up together, they aren't as important as the shared goal of achieving the sort of respect, the consistency and the security that our care workers need, but they are manifest. We have 2 bargaining units, which we've already talked about, that are established. We have enormous regional disparities. We have 3 models of delivery, private, third sector, and obviously direct. And we also have definitional issues. I mean, there's a big lump of things to deal with. And because the point was made, I'll address it. We would really look forward to working with employers to see how we can increase trade union density in a sector which is really quite hard to organise in because of its disparate nature, and we're pleased to hear that the benefits of union membership and union negotiating are recognised. I want to return to the fact that the model that we're talking about, the model that has been being developed, is the best way to do that. And to remind, I guess, the committee and to remind everyone that there is a very broad consensus around that, and to remind people that there's nothing in this LTM, as far as we're concerned, that should prevent that happening, nor happening immediately. There is nothing in this process, as far as we are concerned, that should slow down the discussions that are taking place and ultimately the creation of a constitution for a negotiating body that we've been talking about.
Around negotiations, and it was mentioned that the services are delivered locally, and in many cases, Karen, you mentioned in remote areas. Would there be any conflict or with local representation from union reps at that level? Would they be missed out in the negotiation, and would there be difficulties in bringing that local element into it?
I guess in a way, one might just look at other bargaining arrangements, even though in many ways they're different. So obviously the local government settlement is agreed by COSLA with the unions involved. But there's a whole set of other negotiations that take place council by council. So when you look at, the terms and conditions in Dundee, they may look in many ways quite different than the terms and conditions in Edinburgh. They'll be underpinned by certain things which are agreed as part of the national framework for agreement, but there'll be other things that continue to be negotiated by unions where present, staff representatives where not, and these would not be touched by a sectoral collective bargaining agreement in that sense. So the only question is what's in play and what isn't, but it wouldn't, from our perspective, at least a trade union perspective, and I think from an employer perspective, remove a whole range of other things that are subject to local discussion and negotiation.
So there are already several care providers who, recognise trade unions, and they do negotiate with them locally. And similarly, for instance, providers work closely in Midlothian, for example, and they established a block contracting model for providers, which then enabled them to offer set hours for care workers, which had consequences of better retention of staff and so on. So it's a really excellent model. What a national negotiation would enable, however, would be that minimum standard that could then be built on locally and flexed locally as and when required, whether that's in a local area or specific to one organisation. It doesn't matter, but it enables that minimum set to work from. And in addition to that, and fundamentally to this process, if it's that tripartite model, it holds all partners accountable to the flow of the funds.
I have no further questions.
Thank you, convener. I find the thank you, convener. I find the discussion really quite helpful. Two elements, the sort of trade union barriers I think is really important, because there's no doubt in our regions we do come across employers who do put barriers up, or certainly fears up for care sector workers, you know, sort of being active within the trade union movement, which is totally unacceptable. So it's really good to hear this from a panel such as yourself, and anything we can do to help, you know, we hope people would approach us about that. But my question really relates to the bit about the agreement that seems to be in place but hasn't actually gone anywhere, which is, you know, is very frustrating. I suppose my question is kind of two parts. Is one, what are the barriers, and what kind of, you know, that a committee such as ourselves do to try and help get that moved forward? And secondly, I suppose, in terms of us looking at the LCM, you know, if we pass the LCM, do you think that that would nudge that closer and allow us to get that done if we get this legislation through in this part of the Parliament?
So, on the first part of the question, as far as I know, the barrier at the moment is the Scottish Government. So I was part of the drafting group representing employers who have been developing the constitution for the proposed body. And we pretty much reached agreement on what that should look like, and it's gone in for ministerial review, and that has been several months now that it's been in for ministerial review, and we haven't had kind of feedback on, you know, does it have approval, can we move forward with it. My reading between the lines, my understanding is that the introduction of potential legislation may have put the brakes on that to kind of see how this flows through. I very much get the sense that that the introduction of legislation has slowed down the progress. We don't need the legislation to be in place to get it going. We just need ministerial approval. I think, you know, as employers and as unions, I think we're all ready to get around the table. We just need the Scottish Government to say, yes, we're going to get around the table with you and engage in this.
Yeah, I'm slightly cautious here because, as you'll know, as I'm sure the committee knows, there's 3 unions involved in those discussions. It is an ongoing negotiation, and I'm not going to jump ahead of that, although I don't dissent from anything that I've heard, if I can put it that way, with respect to the previous contribution. And it may have been the case, I don't know, it may have been the case that between the publishing of the bill, and in particular the period around November and December when it was involved in first reading, and the clarification on the powers of the ministers which have appeared in the amendments and are now subject to this second LCM, I could see why that might have caused a problem, because obviously you're looking potentially at a situation where UK legislation says you can't do that anymore. Now, the UK legislation, as tabled and now as amended, doesn't say you can't do that anymore. And therefore, any impediment that may have existed, and I underline the may because I don't know, were that to be the case, it shouldn't be the case now, because the bill, which is overwhelmingly supported, obviously within the House of Commons itself, but also by the majority of the parties in this Parliament, looks likely to pass. And if this LCM is passed, then I think the Scottish Government has a very clear trajectory, which makes clear that there should be no impediment to making that progress. And were there to be further impediment, it sounds as if the responsibility would lie at its door.
Thank you.
Thanks, Convener. And good morning to yourselves. I would like to explore a little bit COSLA's submission, which included a part of it saying that they would request that all directly employed local government employees in this sector would actually be removed from the scope of any negotiation arrangements. And I'm just wondering how that would actually work in practice. So if this came to be, if we're thinking about the parity of esteem and you know, everything that's been sought after, if local government employees working in social care were removed from this, could that actually work, or what would be the consequences of that? And I know from their perspective it's round about the job matching processes that they have within their own you know, local authority area, etc. So I'm just wondering if we can explore that a little bit.
Yeah, so As we mentioned earlier, the model that we've been developing is a kind of an underpin model. So we'd be looking at setting minimum sets of terms and conditions, the idea being that that sits across the sector. However, there are already clearly some parts of the sector where they have existing collective bargaining on a national basis in place, in local government and Agenda for Change. So we debated long and hard around how those could or should interact. And where we landed on was the gap is so big at the moment that it's not really an issue we need to worry about right now, but potentially in the future, what we're aiming for is that we close that parity gap between public sector and workers across the rest of the sector. So what the language that we've proposed is that the negotiating bodies for Agenda for Change and for local government should be paying due regard to what's happening within the sectoral bargaining arrangement when they go into their own negotiations. So that doesn't necessarily mean that they are bound by it, but they should be looking across and say, okay, what's been agreed here, and let's take that into account when we're looking at how that would impact on our own bargaining arrangements. So they can sit alongside each other.
So for me, this raises concerns about the timeliness of the procedure. So we already know how long it takes for Agenda for Change to settle, and that has implications particularly for care home providers who offer nursing, because it's very difficult to calculate your pay differentials. You're doing it in advance. Doesn't necessarily add up. So you're setting your budgets before you know how much you're going to be paying your staff. And, given the financial constraints upon the sector and the number of providers that we've seen closing, even just this year, that has huge concerns about the viability for the sector going on. So whatever happens, we need to consider the timeliness and how this works for an organisation to be sustainable and viable on an ongoing basis. I also, with regards to Causel's statement, wonder, and I'm sure I've said this sitting here before, about how this sits in job evaluation. So the work that a care worker does is very different now from what it does what they did several years ago. It's moving much more into the space where we're undertaking more tasks which were previously considered to be health-based tasks, much more specialisms like peg feeding, the use of stomas, particular support around about those who have advanced neurological conditions, dementia. The clinical sign-off aspect that's required now is much different from what it was even 3 years ago. And I wonder if there's a requirement to undertake job evaluation within local authority, which would significantly increase actually the pay terms and conditions that care workers should be entitled to. And I think that will throw things out of kilter and have fiscal challenge. What that means for the independent sector, as Leslie said, there's already a significant gap. So the closure of that and the ability to fund that does pose big questions for government. But remember, if those things weren't happening in care homes or in people's homes, they would be happening in clinical settings. And we don't have the capacity to do that there. Nor should people have to have that there when they could have it in the place where they live.
That's very helpful, actually. Thank you.
I really just associate myself with those comments, and particularly Leslie's point. I mean, the day that the outcomes of hopefully our negotiating body begin to put pressure on direct sector pay will just be when we hit that problem, we'll deal with it when we come, because it will be a very happy day, to be quite honest with you.
Just go on.
Thank you, and just a declaration of interest as a practising NHS GP, a current BMA member and previous chair of the GP Trainees Committee. So I want to explore a little bit about care homes. At the moment, what is the difference that a local authority pays itself for a resident compared to what it pays for a resident in a private care home?
Do you mean what does it cost the local authority to deliver that, the equivalent of, and compared to what they would pay? So at the moment, they pay a care home just less than £1,000 a week per resident. It costs 3 times that for a local authority to deliver, although we don't actually know for sure what the figures and the statistics are. That would be a helpful undertaking, but given how busy things are in social care, we've not done an FOI to spare them the challenge of that. But some local authorities have recently published their costs. So there was one in Ayrshire, and then one of the local authorities, NHS Highland, had also published some of their costs as well. And also recently, there was a report done by the Liberal Democrats looking specifically to Highland as well, and that presented more detail around about the local costs. But we do know it's in the region of 3 times as much, but it would be very helpful to do more work into that space.
Thank you. So we're looking at, let's just say around three times. We know the terms and conditions are better for staff working within local authority care homes. Is that a fair thing to say?
Pay is higher, pension is higher, yes, so yeah.
But that comes with a 3 times cost for that sector. So if we were to, and look, we all agree that social care staff need better pay, better terms and conditions, but if we were to create bargaining which would hopefully create parity of esteem with local authority, I mean that is, or maybe raise the standards overall, but at least parity, how is that affordable without proper funding going into the private care home sector?
So the proper funding is required, hence the need to have that tripartite model to follow the funding from source to execution. One of the great things about the independent care sector is it's a place where innovation happens. It's a place where we, consider new models of care. It's a place of entrepreneurship, and that's what's really required to make sure that we're moving at the pace that social care requires, to make sure that we're delivering, what people in this century are looking for when they access care and support. So that ability to flex also offers ability to make savings in other spaces and places. For instance, thinking about the introduction of technology, uptake of that has been higher in the independent sector than it has in the statutory sector, in a way that enables people to deliver more care and support and focus on that, streamlining of back office functions, things like that. So that's how we can continue to offer greater savings in that sector. But when it comes down to what we're offering our staff, then absolutely the funding has to come through. We know that the National Care Home Contract at the moment does not offer lines for technology in that space. So the sector being able to do that has obviously come from those who are paying privately, not from government-funded residents. So there's huge need to open that conversation and that can of worms, really, in that space.
You just said there. So is it the case that private residents who are paying privately to be in a care home are subsidising local authority statutory patients that are there?
So it could well be the case, yes, because if you look at the model of care, which is currently based on the National Care Home Contract cost model, the cost model does not include lines relating to all of the care and support that's delivered for people living there, which would suggest that there is a gap, yes, between what they're funded from government and what they're required to deliver. So an example of that, one is technology. 2 is what the requirements are for the buildings guidelines from the Care Inspectorate, changes that have come in post-COVID in terms of infection prevention control measures. There's a list of 18 things, so I can't remember them all, sorry, but I could get them to you if you want them, which are not in that list.
If you could.
Yeah, of course.
Wonderful. So I suppose I want to open up the questions. In a scenario where money is very tight, because that's where we are right now, local authorities have consistently said they have no money. If they do not give more money to the independent sector in care homes, how can we realistically see a significant improvement in pay and conditions if we don't level up what a local authority pays itself compared to what it pays the independent sector?
2 points there. I mean, I would I don't have the figures to hand, but would suggest a little caution, and I think Karen probably implicitly accepted that in assuming that we're talking about a 3-to-1 ratio between costs in the direct public and private provision. And it would be quite a feat to achieve that whilst also paying shareholder profits, including for people who live in tax havens. So I'm not sure I accept the the premise.
If that didn't exist, do you think there would be enough money, even if it was twice as much that the local authority paid itself? So for the comment that you just made there about shareholder profit, if you took away every single penny of profit, would there really still be enough to pay people the same as local authorities?
You're inviting me to make my second point, which was, of course, whatever the nature of provision, more money needs to be put in the system. That's a question of absolute unity between us. The premise that I don't accept is that money being tight is the answer to the question. Money is tight because we choose for money to be tight in this area rather than in another. We choose to raise a little bit less in tax than we might in order to give dignity to patients and dignity to workers. My point is not that my point is less about the comparison and more about the fact that the system needs to be adequately funded, whatever its model of provision, to provide for decent levels of care and decent pay in the system. And that's, I think, a point of absolute unity between the three of us.
Can I come in on the back of what you said, Dave? So I will also forward on a copy of our myth-busting report, which was published last week, which provides the updated figures on the amount of profit that the care sector has made. It's less than half of what a bank thinks it should make to be financially viable. We also have to consider that those funds have to be reinvested into the care homes, into the capital infrastructure and into training and development for staff. So the reality is somewhat different for government funded residents than the picture that Dave paints. So happy to share that report. The contents of the report are taken from other reports, so independent organisations. We've just put them all into one place to make it easy to read. So it's not information that Scottish Care has put out, it's information from other organisations.
My final question. What impact has the national insurance rise had?
Pretty catastrophic.
Yeah, devastating.
Yeah, absolutely. I think devastating and catastrophic are probably two words to describe the impact that it's had on our members. I think the latest estimate was £34 million of additional cost for the non-profit sector that local authorities are telling our members that there will be no increased payments to fund. So that is sending our members into very difficult conversations with their boards where they're projecting loss-making years ahead. They're projecting major deficits. They're having to use reserves just to keep the wheels turning and to keep providing care and support to the people that we support. It's an extremely worrying time for providers who are worried every day about how they're going to keep the lights on and actually just keep providing the care and support to the people who so desperately need it, some of the most vulnerable people in our society.
Yeah, I mean, we recognise the figures published by the Cabinet Secretary in terms of the difference between the impact on the Scottish public sector and the degree to which that has been compensated for through the Barnett formula mechanism. So, you know, that looks to us to be a shortfall across the whole of the public sector of around £300 million, and therefore the figures that Leslie's put forward seem accurate with respect to that.
So for the independent sector, so that incorporates also the not-for-profit sector, the figure is sitting at around about 84 million of a shortage. What we've seen is a number of small care homes intimating closure already this financial year. And the real risk that has to the local community, with people now having to move 2 hours away from their home, from their family, from the community that they grew up in and worked in. So the impact is absolutely huge on the sector, and I'm incredibly worried about what's going to happen going forward. I will say that Scottish Government have responded incredibly positively and have stepped up a viability group, which is meeting every week with ourselves and COSLA to look at mitigating factors to some of those risks. But the reality is we will push things as far down the road as possible. But as we're already seeing closures, we will see that tendency to move from a smaller care provider to a larger one. For our home care providers, however, what we're seeing is a changing in the eligibility criteria in local areas. So that is now resulting in fewer people being able to access care and support that's funded by government. So fewer commissioned hours from care providers. It's difficult for people to see. You can see when a care home closes in a community the impact that has. You don't necessarily see the same for a home care provider, because what happens is they deliver less care and support. What that means on the ground is they're hiring fewer people. So that impact is hidden to a certain extent, but that's the reality. Fewer people get a service and fewer people have employment in that local area.
And I think also to the point that we're here to talk about today, terms and conditions for workers in the social care sector, the impact on the ability of providers to actually give any kind of meaningful pay increase or improve terms and conditions for people has been completely obliterated or severely challenged by these increased costs. And we're seeing the first industrial action in social care in 10 years about to take place in a couple of weeks.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning to the panel, and thank you for the evidence so far. I think you paint a picture, or of it's quite a disparate social care sector. And I think that one of the things you talked about was in terms of the lack of parity of esteem between public and private, and that is growing. And given that the independent sector really have limited control over costs. And what they have to, and how they have to deliver that. Therefore, they haven't got the flex, the same as potentially the sort of local government has. So, can I just follow on from my colleague Sandra Goswami's questions, how you may think that the national negotiating body might affect or impact commissioning or procurement decisions going forward? Yeah, whatever.
So fundamentally, this is why we need to have that tripartite model to make sure that there's an understanding of the flow of the funds and resources that are required to enact and enable whatever is negotiated within that body. And remember, new models of care and support might also be part of that conversation that would actively go a long way in terms of freeing up some of the challenges or barriers in those local areas. At the moment, decisions are made, but it's sometimes difficult to see those funds come through locally. And that's what this model would enable in that space.
Yeah, I mean, to one extent or other, I've been around this discussion for around 20 years, and it has always been understood that the models of commissioning, so it's not just the quantum, but the models of commissioning matter. The potential security and certainty for those who deliver the services being one of those factors. So even if some of these factors might not be within the immediate terms of reference of a negotiating body, they're bound to be conditioning factors. So, I give an example. If I was a voluntary sector provider or a representative thereof, I might want to say how more easily it would be for me to deliver X or Y based upon the fact that I had more certainty in my funding stream. So I think there is an undeniable interrelationship between models of commissioning and the ability to reach agreements on a kind of national level that we're looking for, which are bound to be part of that conversation.
So if we develop that slightly more, if there is a negotiation and the terms and conditions which we all agree. I think there's no disparity in that. I think we all agree that the terms and conditions of our care sector need significant improvement. But in doing that, the implications of that to the private sector or to the independent sector would be that there's a cost implication, and if there's no further money investment, what will happen is the independent sector will be more closures. And perhaps you can maybe explain the impact that would have on the overall sector.
You're absolutely right. So if money doesn't come in to cover costs, then yes, there'd be closures. It'd be the same thing if I went to the supermarket and paid less for the food than what it cost them to provide that loaf of bread, for instance. It would no longer be sustainable, and at some point they would close down. Other risks are actually that some of the staff become self-employed. More likely to happen in home care, but there are questions around about the legality of that, and then that would remove any access they would have to employee rights in total, and have the complete adverse impact of what we're trying to achieve through this negotiation. So there are two routes down which, so either they find a different way to be able to pay staff less or to offer less in terms of conditions. So we really need to get a handle of this to enable that sustainability, because if we don't have the access to the right terms and conditions and pay for our staff, then, and if they are then having less, then we'll see what we have at the moment, which is a very transient workforce and a difficulty in holding on to our workforce, and people leaving the sector to undertake other roles, for instance. And nothing against hospitality, but it's the same rate of pay currently, plus you'll get tips to what people working in the social care sector would get. And that questions how we as a country value people who require access to care and support, if we value that more. And as I said earlier, if a care home closes, it might mean that people are travelling up to 2 hours to go and visit their loved ones. One of my colleagues, and actually she's just joined our board, she talks about how one of the residents in her care home is her librarian that helped her when she was a kid. One of them is one of her teachers from when she went to school. And we'd really lose that community connection and that ability to give back to those elders who were there for us in our younger years. I might be somewhere in the middle personally, but that community relationship and that community sense of community would be lost also, and that would be a failure for Scotland.
Running very short of time, but actually over time, so if you could keep your questions...
I'll leave it.
Okay, thank you. And if the panel can maybe be succinct in their responses, I'd be very grateful. Aileen Whittam.
I don't have no further
You don't have a
questions.
supplementary.
Thank you.
Gillian Mackay.
Thanks, convener, and good morning to the panel. I'll maybe try and stick some of my questions together if we're running short of time. I want to specifically ask about the children's social care sector, and should any national negotiating body include those staff working in children's social care services, but also given the number of professionals in there, how easy is it to define and understand that workforce? And if they should be involved in that national negotiating body, how do we approach that potential inclusion to make sure that they have that meaningful voice? And I wonder if I could go to Dave first.
But I think there is a strong case, and I'm going to keep taking this back, I guess, to the LCM and the legislation rather than more generally. There is a strong case for that power also to be devolved to the Scottish Government. What form any consequent negotiating body or offshoot of that might take, I think it's probably too long, and I may not be the right qualified person to do it, but it does kind of make sense, in the same way as at the moment child social care pay rates essentially flow from adult social care pay rates, or at least minimum. So your average council will say, this is what the adult social care have decided as a minimum will apply that to children. So there clearly is some form of interrelationship. There is something to deal with there. There is a case for that following the same route as adult social care, but we won't have time and I may not have the expertise to say exactly what that should look like.
Great, thanks. I don't know if any of the rest of the panel want to come in, convener.
Our members have been very clear that a national body must include the ability to negotiate for workers in the children's sector as well. There is no clear delineation, particularly within the third sector, between providers who provide support and care to adults and those who provide support and care to children. There are many organisations that do both. You know, people don't just suddenly turn from a child into an adult overnight. You know, there's a difficult transition for people who are you know, particularly vulnerable. So to carve out a kind of distinct policy sector and say we'll treat it one way doesn't take cognizance of the fact that these are human beings who move through all different stages in their life, and we need to make sure that an equal provision is in place, whether staff are supporting someone who's 17 or someone on their 18th birthday.
Our members only provide to adults, so I will abstain in detail. However, with reference to the challenging transition periods, not only is it for transition between children's into adult services, there is a similar challenge around about age 65 when you see a significant drop in funding available to individuals.
That's great. It's useful. Thanks, convener.
Okay. Do you have any further questions, Ms.
No,
Mackay? No,
I'm all good. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for that, and thank you for being so succinct. Can I just ask one final question regarding the social care workforce and the announcement last week from Westminster about the, I suppose, immigration cuts to particularly social care workers? I think, Leslie, you spoke earlier on about a shortage of workers being one of the most challenging things for the workforce in a key sector. So I just wondered if you had any final comments on that.
Yeah, it's just another blow to the sector from Westminster. And I would reflect as well that Scotland is already a bit more progressive in social care than England. It's not perfect, it's far from perfect, but it's at least aspirational, and the language we hear from the Scottish Government is much more supportive of the sector than the quite shocking rhetoric and language that we've heard from the UK Government. And we were pleased to hear the Minister rebut that rhetoric when she spoke a few days ago. So I would just urge us to think more aspirationally and more progressively than what Westminster is saying. We can make change in spite of UK Labour legislation, not because of it or thanks to it. We have a way forward. We don't need to rely on what the UK Government are doing. We can, and actually, the Scottish people deserve better than what the UK Government is putting in place for us. The change to immigration legislation is just another blow to an already very, very stretched sector.
Yeah, as a matter of principle, I refuse to combine anything I say about migration to labour force or economistic grounds, reminding people of the enormous contribution that migrants make to our wider cultural well-being. But if we are talking about the direct impacts on this sector, I think it's going to be very grave. Arguably, it could be even more grave in Scotland because there's a generalised, again, back to our labour market stuff, a generalised case to be made for migration in Scotland, which may not prevail exactly in the same way across the UK, underlining our view that there should be migration powers devolved to Scotland in order that we can meet our particular cultural and labour market needs.
Scottish Care will be releasing the results of a report that we have produced on the back of response to the immigration challenges. And the announcements by Westminster Government, so we can send a copy of that tomorrow when that's available. I understand that there's a meeting this afternoon with the First Minister on it, and they will receive an embargoed copy of that report. if I said that we made the survey available on, I think, late Thursday, maybe Friday morning, and by yesterday evening over half of our members had responded to it, perhaps that shows evidence of the feeling from the sector. At the time Brexit negotiations were happening, we were involved in discussions around about a devolved set of responsibilities for immigration for Scotland. Our position on that hasn't really changed. We know that the requirements for Scotland are often different, particularly for our care homes. What we find is that one member of a family moves here to work in that care home, and then they bring other members of their family and they also work in that care home. So any changes to current visas, it's not just an individual that will be affected. We will see whole families being uprooted from local communities, and that will have a huge impact in that space.
Very briefly, Mr. Lincoln.
Thank you for letting me back in on that particular point. My only caveat that I wanted to ask you was around, have we used cheap labour immigration to keep our costs down? That's my only caveat to that, in that if we are going to continue to have the immigration, that the pay level is sustained.
It's a very good question, and good to be able to respond to that. And that is the benefit of the work that we've been doing with the Fair Work and Social Care Group to date. You know, we have a commitment to pay the living wage, and that applies to all social care staff. I would still say that it's not enough for all social care staff, regardless of where they're from, but the commitment that everyone is paid equally remains.
I recognise the economic reality behind what you described. Is why we've always argued for increased powers for Scotland over migration, hand in hand with increased powers over employment regulation and the mechanisms we're talking about, because there is that risk. I mean, the truth being, you know, maybe the negotiating position of a completely decimated social care workforce would increase as a consequence of a labour market crisis, but that wouldn't be something I think that any reasonable person would want to happen, given the need to care for so many people in society.
The witnesses for their attendance this morning and for your evidence. It has been very helpful for the committee in terms of our scrutiny of this LCM. The committee will continue working, but if you wish to leave, please feel free to do so. The third item on our agenda today is consideration of the following negative instrument, the Human Tissue Supply of Information about Transplants Scotland Regulations 2025. The purpose of this instrument is to create a duty for relevant clinicians to notify the Human Tissue Authority if they are made aware that their patient has received a transplant outside the UK, or have a reasonable suspicion that specified offences under human tissue or modern slavery legislation may have been committed. The Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee considered the instrument at its meeting on the 13th of May 2025 and made no recommendations in relation to the instrument. No motion to annul has been received in relation to this instrument. And Emma Harper, do you wish to make a comment?
Yes, thanks, Convener. My comment is basically to identify that this instrument is to support the better ability to procure data in terms of organ transplantation and recipients and out-of-country transplantation. And you know, I'm a former liver transplant nurse, kidney and pancreas also. So I'm just thinking about, we know how people move around the planet. They may come to Scotland as a recipient, quite rightly, of organ donation. So I'm interested in how this instrument will help support the better information gathering.
Proposal, Ms. Harper?
So I guess my question would be: do we write to the government to ask if we can just basically get some clarification on this instrument and the purpose and the ability to gather information, and then how do we support the clinicians in order to make sure they're aware of this instrument?
So our committee content for us to write to the Minister on that basis and postpone consideration of the LCM? Committee's content. Thank you. I'll now briefly suspend to allow for a changeover of witnesses. The last item on our agenda today in public is to continue the committee's Stage 1 scrutiny of the Right to Addiction Recovery Scotland Bill, and today we will take evidence from the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Social Care and accompanying officials in relation to the bill. And I welcome to the committee Neil Gray, MSP, Cabinet Secretary for Health and Social Care, Scottish Government, Laura Zabalas, Deputy Director, Drugs Policy, and Morven Davidson, Lawyer, Scottish Government Legal Director. And we'll move straight to questions. And Brian Whittle.
Thank you very much, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary and your officials. Can I just ask an initial kind of framing question, if I may, on your understanding of what this bill is about? the choice of somebody or the decision of somebody to ask for help, that incredibly difficult decision of somebody caught in this loop to ask for help. The bill's the whole point of the bill is if that help is asked for, that help will be forthcoming in a very timorous way. Is that your understanding of what the bill is trying to achieve?
Yes, it is. Thank you, Convener. I thank Mr Whittle for his question. I think it's important to set out at the outset that whilst the government is neutral on the bill at this stage, while we await your good work and the further evidence being collated and compiled, I think it's fair to say that the intention of the bill is one that we do support, which is about making sure that we do have timorous access to support when people request it. There are measures in place to support that on a broad sense through the MAT standards and various other elements that are already in train. But the general principle that Mr Whittle sets out is my understanding too.
Given that, do you think there are any barriers in relation to its ability to secure those delivery of rights as set out in the bill?
Could you frame that again, please?
Just to understand from the Scottish Government's perspective, do you anticipate any barriers in relation to its ability to secure that delivery of rights?
Through the bill?
Yes.
Yes, and I think that has come through in some of the evidence that's been provided by the likes of Public Health Scotland and the Royal College of General Practitioners that have set some of those issues out, as well as what some of those that have contributed in evidence have suggested could be an unintended consequence, which is around this potentially becoming exclusionary for only those that are able to follow a particular path. And we're very clear that, as Mr Whittle set out in his opening question, that the challenge that there is for somebody that's in this situation where they have a substance dependency, they have probably had a varying degree of interaction with statutory or community and voluntary services, and their decision to come forward to seek help is in itself a momentous moment and one that we should be supporting and embracing. But we must make sure that there is a Gurphy approach taken at that point, that we are a getting it right for everyone approach, where it is person-centred, and that a recognition that an abstinence-based approach is not for everybody at that stage, that initial stage of seeking help. And there are other ways of getting people to a point of finding their own recovery, which could include going through residential rehab or various recovery treatment options. But the MAT standards already provide for the timeliness of how that should be delivered, and which is within hours actually of that first presentation. And against the most recent quarterly data, we are showing that the 90% target is being exceeded at the moment. That's not to say that there is not more work to be done there. There is, because there are gaps in certain parts of the country. But I think the work that has been done through the National Mission over recent years has certainly improved the picture and people being able to seek access to support and help at the point that Mr Whittle raises. They are asking for it.
Thank you for that. Can I ask then, given the bills, obviously it's at stage one at the moment, are there any amendments that would be required to enable the successful implementation of the bill from a Scottish Government perspective?
That's not something that I could comment on at this stage, because we've taken a neutral position on the bill, and we're reserving our judgment until the conclusion of the committee's work. And we would obviously rest upon the work of the committee and the expert opinion that has come through in evidence as to arrive at the government's position thereafter.
Okay, I'll leave it there just now if I could, Camilla.
Thank you. Elaine Whittam.
Good morning, and both of your officials. I'm interested in exploring a few issues round about the Charter of Rights as developed by the National Collaborative and everybody who played a part in that, but also in general about the enforcement of individuals' rights and how all of that interplays with this proposed bill. So the Cabinet Secretary will be very aware of the launching of the Charter of Rights. And within that launch, it does state that once the proposed Scottish Human Rights Bill becomes law, these internationally recognised rights will also become enforceable in our tribunals and in our courts that are set out in the Charter of Rights. And we did hear some evidence from the Scottish Human Rights Commission, which says that some of the rights as set out in the Charter of Rights are not yet enforceable in our domestic law because they haven't actually been incorporated. And indeed, the auditor in Audit Scotland had said that people are still facing significant barriers in getting support. And we know that that ranges from stigma, limited access to services in rural areas, etc. So I would like to kind of explore how the bill as set out, how would that actually complement the Charter of Rights for people affected by substance use, or could it actually come in conflict with it?
I'll bring Ms Davidson in to provide more detail upon this in a second, but Ms Whittam is correct in her assessment of where the Charter is intended to take us and where legislatively we would wish to travel. And I was there alongside, the First Minister was also there at the launch of what is an internationally recognised piece of work in further embedding the understanding of service users as to their rights in terms of accessing treatment, in terms of accessing services, and the greater support that should be providing. I can't take a position in terms of the potential impact of this bill, but I think there has been evidence that has come through this committee that has suggested that there has the potential to conflate some of the elements in terms of rights and treatment available. And I believe that were this bill to be enacted, it would be the first time that it would provide a right to a treatment in legislation, which isn't incorporated in any other aspect of health and social care, which is in itself a potential challenge. But I'll bring Ms Davidson in if she wishes to add any further detail to the points that I've raised.
Thanks. Yeah, so just in terms of how the bill interacts with the Charter of Rights, the Charter is a document, it doesn't create new rights as such, it draws together existing rights which are already available at international and domestic level. And the purpose is to make those rights more accessible and to enable service providers to adopt a human rights approach. So there's no conflict between the two in a legal sense. They would, the Charter is not a legislative instrument. The two would just sit side by side, because what it does is just draws on existing rights which are already available in the drug and alcohol treatment sphere.
Okay, so if I could explore a little bit further then in terms of if this bill was to be enacted, how could it align with any future human rights bill that might come to Scotland? And obviously, that's been delayed, so we don't have that in this parliamentary term. There is a promise from the current Scottish Government that will tick over into the next parliamentary session and would be something that would be brought forward. So I'm interested in understanding how this bill could potentially align with a Scottish human rights bill.
As there's legal interaction here, I think I'll defer to Ms Davidson.
That's fine. Thank you. So I think this was touched on in the Scottish Human Rights Commission's evidence to the committee. So I suppose the basic legal position is that legislation is capable of incorporating international human rights. States are, I suppose, given a wide margin of appreciation in terms of how they incorporate human rights into domestic law. So the question of whether the bill is an appropriate vehicle to do that, or whether it would achieve effective incorporation, is more a question for the member in charge.
Thanks very much for that. And I guess my last area to look at is about enforcement of rights. So if we think about the current situation now, so we won't think about hypothetically if we have a Scottish Human Rights Bill in the next session, which we don't have a crystal ball. If we think about it just now, I would really be interested in what steps the Scottish Government's taken to ensure that people who experience substance use are able to ensure that their existing rights are realised in the absence of this bill, as proposed, and in the absence of a Scottish Human Rights Bill being able to underpin and make their rights enforceable. Because we do hear about the fact that people are not always able to realise what they seek in terms of treatment in their local areas. And right now there's kind of an enforcement gap in the system that people are not actually able to challenge effectively or don't know the routes open to them.
So again, I'll bring Ms Davidson in on directly on enforcement on where we are right now. I would say that we believe strongly that we are compliant on a human rights basis with the services that are being provided. There is more work to be done, and I think I've set that out in my initial response to Mr Whittle. And I think the Charter provides us with a greater basis from which we are making sure that those who are seeking to access those services are understanding of what their rights are and where they can turn to in order to access those services on a human rights basis, and making sure that it is grounded in that position was a central focus, as Ms Whittam will know from her previous experience, in the work of the National Collaborative, and it has garnered international recognition as a result. But I'll turn to Ms Davidson in terms of where we are with regards to enforcement at this present time.
So in terms of, do you mean enforcement of current rights which are available in law?
Yeah.
Well, it might be helpful if I just talk a little bit about what those rights are and how they're accessed. So there are a number of potentially relevant international and domestic human rights relevant to the treatment of drug and alcohol abuse. So some examples are Article 2, which protects the right to life, Article 3, which protects individuals from torture and inhumane treatment. So these are rights which are currently enshrined in our domestic law, and they are enforceable through our domestic courts. You touched on international obligations, so I think the one that's most relevant here is Article 12, which protects the right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. So this right is not yet incorporated into our domestic law. So while states do have an obligation to comply, there's currently no route to enforcement of that right in the domestic courts.
Okay, so I guess my last and final question round about this would be, so as it exists at the moment, how are individuals able to actually challenge the treatment that they receive or the treatment that they would like to receive but are not receiving? What redress do they have just now? How do they actually realise their right to those existing rights that we have in domestic law? How do they do that?
So there are various avenues open, and the one that I would point to most obviously is the statutory providers complaints process that we would all have interaction with as constituency MSPs, in ensuring that the principles and the law that Ms Davidson has set out is being applied. As I say, the MAT standards that we have set our local delivery partners the challenge of meeting, the last quarter demonstrated that we're beyond that 90% target. That shows that there is still work to be done in terms of making sure that we are delivering a system that meets with the expectations of the MAT standards, that we are seeing TIMIUS support being provided and treatment being provided. But I think it demonstrates the broad and supportive culture that my expectation is for people who are in the situation that Mr Whittle outlined in the first instance, that people are able to get access to treatment and support at the earliest point of interaction with services. But there are various mechanisms through which people can seek redress should that not be the case, and the most obvious one being a health board or an ADP's complaints process.
Okay, thank you.
Sanders Gohani.
Declaration of interest as a practising NHS GP. Cabinet Secretary, the Scottish Government has legislated for cancer treatment times. So why can we not do something similar for drugs and alcohol?
So what we didn't do within the cancer waiting times was legislate as to what the treatment would be. and this legislation, my understanding is setting out what the treatment should be, which is, as I said earlier, a significant departure from the rights that people have in other aspects of health and social care. We have already set out, as I've said, in both response to Mr Whittle and in response to Ms Whittam, that we've set out the MAT standards, which set very clear expectations around treatment times, for which we are seeing good performance. There's always room for improvement, but we are seeing good performance. So I don't take a position in terms of what the bill is legislating for. I've already set out that we are neutral upon that, but I am in agreement in principle around the intention of supporting more people towards treatment. And it's obviously for the member in charge to set out the point that Mr Gilhani is raising around where there is legislation for waiting times or for treatment elsewhere within health and social care, because I believe that this would be the first time that we're specifically legislating for a right to a particular treatment that's not available elsewhere.
Thank you.
Carol Mochan.
I'm interested really in the National Service Specification for Substance Use Support Service, and the Government have committed to publishing this, and I just wondered if there's any idea when that might happen. But, you know, with it happening, you know, how do you think this will impact, or how will the impact of the service specification be monitored? And what contribution will implementation of the service specification make towards meeting the intended outcome of this bill? So that's the kind of two things I'm interested in.
I thank Ms Mochan for her question. We don't have a timescale at this stage in terms of Ms Mochan's direct ask. There is work underway at the moment to review the national mission on drugs and drug-related harm, but also where we are with alcohol services as well. And so we've had a number of sessions with a wide variety of stakeholders, including those with lived and living experience of a substance dependency, both alcohol and drugs, to look at the areas that Ms Mochan is interested in, because our intention is to set out what our plan is at the conclusion of the national mission, which is clearly at the end of this Parliament, where we're also cognizant that the work is demonstrably not complete. We still have much work to do. So whilst the national mission is coming to a conclusion, there is work still to be done, and we need to review, which we're currently embarking upon, the efficacy and the performance of various aspects of the national mission, but also our alcohol interventions, and we will be setting out our plans around both before the conclusion of this year.
Can I just ask a little bit about this bill in terms of, you know, do you see the use of this sort of support services, you know, how it would link with the bill if it was in place?
I don't think there's a lot that I can add to that, given the government's position at this stage on the bill in and of itself. I can't comment on the specifics of the bill. All I can set out is the wider work that we are doing at the minute, which I set out to Ms Mochan in answer to her first question. But I think there is a need for us to make sure that we have clear coherence and support in place for both those with either a drug or an alcohol dependency, and make sure that we take further action, because the drug and alcohol related harms in Scotland are far too high. There has been progress made, but in terms of the social infrastructure that's available, the destigmatising of access to these services, and my interest is making sure that we go further in a coordinated way that meets the needs of individuals in the way that they wish to access services, and in a way that works for them, because demonstrably certain interventions will not work for everybody, And so therefore we need to make sure that we have that breadth of intervention as well as the depth of availability. And that's what the work that's currently underway is seeking to address.
Thank you.
Gillian Mackay.
Thanks, Convener, and good morning to the Cabinet Secretary and his officials. The bill places significant decision-making responsibility on professionals, on a single health professional, yet current practice emphasises a multidisciplinary approach which involves social work, care staff, ADPs, a whole load of professionals. Given the importance of the multi-agency and multidisciplinary input in recovery care, how does the Scottish Government assess the risk that the bill's current framing could undermine existing collaborative practice and care planning?
Thank you, Convener. I thank Ms Mackay for her question. Again, I'm not going to comment on the bill in of itself, but I think there is evidence that has already been led through committee, bless you, on the importance of that multidisciplinary team. And going back again to the response that I gave to Mr Whittle and to Ms Whittam around making sure that we are getting it right for everybody and providing services in a way that makes going through this process as easy as possible, as destigmatised as possible, having various opportunities for interaction is critical. And so the multidisciplinary team, in my mind, is fundamental to ensure that we have the breadth and the depth that I was referring to in response to Ms Mochan's question around where we go next. And I'm clear that we need to meet people where they are, as opposed to where it's easier for us to deliver services. And that's certainly what we're seeking to do.
On that particular point about meeting people where they are, there's a requirement in the bill for diagnoses to be made and treatment plans to be made in person with a clinician. Given the work this committee has done previously around remote and rural healthcare, does the Cabinet Secretary have a concern about people having to travel for these in-person appointments rather than how services are currently delivered?
Again, I appreciate Ms Mackay's question. It'll be for the member in charge to discuss some of these elements rather than for the government to take a position on it at this stage. I have read with interest some of the evidence that has come through that I think Ms Mackay's concern has also expressed. That's also come through in some of the evidence around the need for a diagnosis as opposed to people seeking help. And I would wish to stress the importance of making sure that we get this right for everybody, and we are, return to that phrase, meeting people where they are, and making it as accessible rather than exclusionary at all points. And again, I think those points have come through in evidence that's been led to the committee already.
Great, thanks, Convener.
Thank you. Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener. I think Gillian Mackay has made a good point about rural. I'm always interested in rural issues and healthcare and challenges, and we've got some really good third sector organisations that are part of the multidisciplinary team, like With You in Stranraer as well as in Dumfries and in the Borders as well. And so I'm interested in whether you think there's anything specifically that needs to be included or any omissions that would support or enhance care for people in rural areas in the bill, because I know there's challenges of implementing the MAT standards rurally and confidentiality for going to rural services. So it's basically to pick up on what Gillian Mackay said about anything that you think needs to be added.
Thank you, Convener. I appreciate Ms Harper's question. Again, I can't comment on what's in or out of the bill. What I will say, as somebody who grew up in an island community, recognising the challenge of service delivery as I do, I also recognise, again, returning to the point that Ms Mackay made around the importance of the multidisciplinary team, I would extend that to our community and voluntary sector colleagues. Ms Harper referenced With You. there are a number of organisations in rural and island communities that can be that first point of interaction, and the first opportunity for engagement on a recovery pathway can be with them. And so making sure that we continue to support that breadth of opportunity of engagement is going to be really important, and is certainly something that has come through, referencing again the work that's currently underway that I provided in response to Ms Mockin's question. The roundtables and the stakeholder interaction that we've had that is still ongoing, we've still got work to do over the coming months. That has been a point that has come through strongly, is the need to make sure that we continue to support those community and voluntary organisations in the work that they do. I'll bring in Ms Zabias at this point as well.
So I suppose one thing we know as well from local services and from local delivery is the importance of a range of opportunities for interaction. So we know that local services are they will offer digital engagement, they will offer home visits, they will offer routes of engagement that really recognise particular constraints. So there's really quite an assertive set of activity that goes on around ensuring that we are able to provide the support and the treatment that people need that is not creating artificial barriers.
Thank you, Kavita, and thanks for coming along today. Cabinet Secretary, you touched on the bill's requirement for a need for medical diagnosis, and we've heard in previous evidence sessions some concern around that formalisation. So it's just whether you want to say a little bit more about the concerns that the government has, and you expressed that in the government's written evidence. Also want to ask whether, in relation to that, there's a concern that one of the unintended consequences of that requirement would be a challenge to the existing services which don't require a formal diagnosis.
Yes, I think I appreciate Mr Fitzpatrick's question, Convener, and I think this has been a point that I have seen in other evidence sessions has been an area of concern for the reasons that Ms Zabias set out in response to Ms Harper, and what we set out in my written statement to the committee. We do have a concern around that, and I think the term that's been used by some in evidence is that it could potentially be exclusionary. And the last thing we want, and I know for a fact the last thing that the member in charge would want is for there to be any unintended consequences that would see a position of people feeling excluded or practically being excluded, to the second point that Mr Fitzpatrick raises. And so I think it's important that we have due regard to that, although, as I say, it's for the member in charge to discuss that more substantively, and we will take a more formal position once the committee has completed its work.
Thank you.
A declaration of interest. I am employed as a bank nurse by NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde. I just want to ask a little bit about the reporting requirements, and I note that in the evidence that the government submitted, in particular in relation to section 5 of the bill, that would require ministers to report to Parliament on a range of information that you were asking the committee, invited the committee to consider if there are any considerations in relation to GDPR and the ICO that would impact on the aims of those reporting requirements. I don't know if you're able to say a little bit more about that, about the issues or potential issues or unintended consequences that could arise for government as a result of that if it was enacted in the bill.
Yes, I think in response to Ms Harper, both myself and Ms Zabias recognise that services that are provided in rural and island communities can often be to a very small number of people. And those that represent or have come from rural and island communities will recognise the confidentiality issues that arise from that. And so that is a concern for us. We do have a significant amount of reporting that goes on through government, through Public Health Scotland, through the regular reporting, particularly on the drug side, but also on the alcohol side as well, on harms as well as deaths. And whether that can be strengthened and do more towards, we are currently considering as part of the work that I've spoken of in the review of the national mission. And other than expressing the concern as we did in the submission that we've provided, there's nothing more that I can say around the bill itself, I don't think.
So you're able to see if the reporting requirements set out in the bill are sufficient to meet the monitoring of the bill in meeting its intended outcomes?
That would be something that I think is for exploring with the member in charge. I don't think I can go further than what I've already set out in my written evidence and what I've provided a bit more clarity around in terms of where those concerns arise from. That would, in terms of rural and island communities, that is one area. And clearly, should the bill pass stage 1, or indeed in response to the committee's evidence and the committee's report, we would take a stronger position in terms of those particular aspects, as we will the wider bill itself.
Thank you for that. And of course, it is worth noting that even in more urban areas, there are still small communities
Absolutely.
where confidentiality and so on, and familiarity with friends and neighbours could also have an impact.
Correct.
Sandesh Gohani.
Thank you. So, looking at the bill, I think there's clearly some changes that do need to be made, as we've seen through the process. Do you, Cabinet Secretary, think that with amendments and with changes, the bill would benefit from more time, i.e. passing stage 1 and then coming back to committee for real amendments, to be able to really impact people, as has been said by people who are on the front line?
I hope Mr Gohani will forgive me, the committee will forgive me. We've taken a neutral position on the bill. The position as to whether or not it requires amending or should be amended, could be amended, and whether or not it would meet our expectations is a position that we would return to after the committee has done its work and after we have seen the totality of the evidence that has been led. There are areas that I've already pointed to that I think has come through in evidence that we've set out in my written submission that cause me concern. But we will reserve our final judgment on the basis of the work that the committee does.
So on the reservations, if changes were to be made, I assume the Scottish Government would be happy with the bill.
Again, Mr Gohani will need to forgive me. He's tempted me into taking a position which I cannot do at this stage. The government is neutral on the bill. I've set out the various areas that we have concern around, where government does have policy on, and where there is a significant amount of work ongoing. But in terms of our response to the bill, that will be informed by the good work of this committee. It will be informed by the evidence that has been led through the evidence gathering that the committee has done, and we will take a position on that basis once the committee has reported in before stage 1.
And if I could just return to my previous question to you, the bill doesn't specify what treatment that somebody who's asking for help can receive. There's a myriad of options plus others that aren't listed. So it could be any treatment, but the fact is the person is asking for help and would be guaranteed treatment within a certain amount of time, in a similar way that we would do in other aspects. So again, coming back to the question about the legislation that's occurred in drug and alcohol versus which is what this is trying to do, versus legislation that's happened in cancer care, for example. Why is there such a difference?
I think Convener, I've set out my position in regards to that, that this is specifying a particular treatment pathway, and I think I'll rest there.
My final question is really looking at the number of people who are using substances across Scotland. So does the Scottish Government have reliable and up-to-date information on the number of people that are using substances beyond opioids and alcohol? And is there a way that the Scottish Government is looking to ensure that this unmet need is met?
So by its nature, I thank Mr Gahani for his question. I think by its nature, that is a difficult set of data to establish with certainty, and he will have familiarity from his engagements professionally as to why that would be difficult to get for certain, because people have various engagements with health professionals and others that would help to provide a level of data, but there are others who do not. And that is more difficult for us to substantiate. And part of the success, I believe, of the Thistle in Glasgow is that they are seeing people interact with that service, and therefore, and the wider services that are offered within it around housing, sport, social work, education, the wider service offering that comes through the Thistle for the first time. The people that are engaging there, many of them have never engaged with any form of statutory service before, and so we're capturing information and the opportunity for people to have a recovery pathway for the first time through that intervention. So that serves to illustrate how challenging it is to get to a fuller picture and an accurate picture that Mr Gahani is looking for, because of the complexity of human society and the fact that people will be at varying levels of wishing to get to their own recovery and hiding, understandably, the situation from not just statutory services but members of their family, loved ones, wider social groups. So it is a challenging area for us to get accurate data on. Public Health Scotland obviously report on various elements that Mr Gahani has referenced, but that is a challenge that I'm sure he'll understand.
Thank you.
You and I, Cabinet Secretary, have been round this particular crisis for quite a number of years, and there's much been talked about it. In fact, I think one of the slogans that came out from those watching us was "You keep talking and we keep dying." Despite the whole Chamber's strong desire, gathered round this desire to make significant improvement has not been made. And I wonder whether or not in needing to see a big step change, whether potentially you could look at this bill as a mechanism, even though it must be amended, we accept it must be amended, but could this bill be a mechanism for that significant step change that we have failed to realise over the last decade that I've been in here?
I recognise the intention of the bill to do that. It's a shared objective. I have to reserve my position as to whether the bill could do that, given what I've said around the government's position of neutrality upon it. There has been a significant level of evidence that has been gathered through the committee's work, which I look forward to seeing the compilation of, and we will take our position partly based on that, as well as other considerations. I would say that we clearly and demonstrably have more work to do, both on the alcohol and the drug space. We are seeing too many people losing their lives. We are seeing too many people harmed by their substance dependency. And of course, we need to do more to provide support to them. I do think progress has been made, and I'll point to one, above all else, that I think has changed over the course of the national mission. And that is the stigmatisation of people seeking to get access to services, particularly for drug-related services. And I make that on the basis of my interaction with families who have sadly lost a loved one to a drug dependency, and those that are currently seeing their family members battling with that particular issue. And I recognise that some of this is anecdotal and it's not necessarily empirical, but it is clear to me in the conversations that I've had with those loved ones, particularly those that have lost family members. They are saying, had the services been available previously that are now available, and the stigma been reduced as it has been now, their loved one would have been able to access services in a different way. And so I recognise Mr Whittle's point around there's clearly more work for us to do, and it's right that we provide consideration to a potential way forward that this bill gives us. But there is a significant amount of work going on that is supporting and changing lives. And I point to that one area in particular around stigma that I am told consistently by family members has been a demonstrable shift through the national mission. We need to do more. Again, that's what a reference to Ms Mochan, the fact that demonstrably we are not at the end of the journey. We still have more work to do, and that's what the government is currently reviewing. We're not waiting to the end of the national mission. We are doing that work now. And of course, we keep under consideration this bill as a potential and reserve our judgment upon it whilst the committee does its work.
So I appreciate what you've said this morning, Cabinet Secretary, in terms of Scottish Government's position about you're neutral, that you can't make comments on specifics of the bill. But are there intended outcomes of the proposed bill that could be or are being realised without the need for primary legislation?
Yes, I've set out the work around the MAT standards that I think is well established, and there are other areas that I think we are making progress on in terms of access to and broadening the availability of treatment support, such as the work to expand the publicly funded residential rehab capacity. We are at the position of that commitment that government made being met, and we now need to make sure we continue to sustain that and potentially expand it. Because, as I said at the outset, my firm view is that there is not one particular area that resolves this issue for everybody. We need a multitude of options available to people at various levels of statutory, community and voluntary organisations to ensure that we're responding to people in the way that meets their need. And I think that the breadth and the depth of the national mission helps to provide that. Although clearly we have more work to do, and I don't take away from the fact that far too many people are tragically dying from both alcohol and drug dependency, and we are obviously committed to making sure that we continue to support people to find a route to recovery. But that has to be multifaceted. It has to be on a multidisciplinary basis. It has to reach people in all communities. And that is what we are committed to delivering against.
Thank you. Can I thank Cabinet Secretary and your officials for your attendance this morning and helping the committee to scrutinise this bill. At stage one, at next week's meeting, we will conclude oral evidence as part of the committee's stage one scrutiny of the Right to Addiction Recovery Scotland Bill by hearing from the member in charge of the bill, Douglas Ross MSP. And we will also continue our scrutiny of the supplementary LCM in relation to the Employment Rights Bill, taking evidence from the Minister for Social Care, Mental Wellbeing and Sport. And that concludes the public part of our meeting today.